All right, here we go.
I see a few people are connected. Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give another minute or two for everyone to get connected and get their audio set up. Still see a few people just joining, so we're going to give another 30-ish seconds for everyone to get their audio connected. All right, I think everyone is connected, so we'll go ahead and get started. I appreciate everybody for joining this morning. We'll start off, as always, with a few announcements. Just a quick recap on the conferences that we're confirmed to be going to. Right now, it's a couple of PTC events. So the first one's this week. This is the Badgerland PTC Users Group. They do a monthly webinar series, and I'll be speaking at that. And then in October, we have the main PTC user event that we'll be sponsoring at. And a quick reminder on the support form on our website or directly opening tickets via email. Both of those still work. But I do want to kind of announce the new thing. So we had discussed this a little bit last month, and now the user portal that we have is live. So you may have received an email about this. We've been kind of doing a staggered rollout. But attached to our ticketing system, there's a user portal, so you can make an account and manage all of your tickets there. And we also have, right now, a small, but we're looking to grow it, a knowledge base. So one of the articles you'll see is all of the recordings for tips and tricks. You can search through this and find old videos, that sort of thing. To sign up, you just have to go to support.enginsoftusa.com, and there'll be a registration page there. We'll approve your sign up, and then you'll get a confirmation email. You can actually log in and start using the system. And with that, I will pass the torch over to Chris for his presentation.
All right, thanks, James. Some good information about the support stuff. Go ahead and share my screen. All right, so today's presentation, I want to cover a little bit of our capabilities a little bit of our heat transfer capabilities in Particleworks. Won't go into depth just because of the time constraints we have today, but just a quick overview of some of the things we can do with heat transfer inside of Particleworks. Those capabilities are we can do heat transfer between fluids and our walls, which are going to be polygon wall definition. We can do heat conduction in solids. We can do, and this is a fairly new feature, is the conjugate heat transfer between fluids and solids. One thing I will say about the conjugate heat transfer, it's similar to the finite volume method where we have to have double precision for solving capabilities. And we can also do temperature-dependent fluid properties. So if you want to look at things like non-Newtonian fluids or inviscid fluids, this is a way to do that. All of this stuff is really laid out really well in the theory manual. If you have some interest in any of these, I would recommend taking a look at the theory manual and seeing what all has in that information. Now, one thing we can do, and this is I'd say fairly common amongst most Particleworks users, is one of the things that they're going to be looking for is maybe a heat transfer coefficient, and that's generally calculated and mapped onto a wall. And you can have the option to export it out into a CSV file, and you can actually export that CSV file and import it into another maybe FEA, thermal or stress analysis study. Kind of how we do that is we do the Particleworks solar distribution. Particleworks, obviously, we'll do the heat transfer coefficient distribution on the walls, and then we'll use those as boundary conditions in our FEA solver or FEA thermal or stress solver. Excuse me. One thing too that we can also do is we have a plugin for the Ansys Workbench, and that just automates all of that process altogether. So if you are one of our customers using Particleworks and you have Ansys that's available to you, you can you'd have to purchase the plugin for Ansys Workbench, and everything that I was describing in the previous slide, that can all be done automatically, and you won't have to really export anything out from a CSV, import it into a different program, things like that. It's all seamless. It's pretty neat. So if you have any interest in that, let us know. We'll be happy to get you set up with that. And just a little bit of background on some of the behind the stuff that's going on behind the scenes is when we do a heat transfer analysis, we have to define our walls in such a way that we can actually do the heat transfer analysis. I know sometimes I get tripped up on this myself. I kind of jump the gun a little bit and forget that by default the walls are going to be adiabatic, which obviously there's not going to be any heat transfer. So when the walls are adiabatic, there isn't any heat transfer being evaluated. It's basically ignored. But we do have a couple of other options. One is going to be the isothermal for walls, and that's going to basically be a heat source with a fixed temperature. And then the other one is going to be more of calculation. This is going to be if you're going to actually use like a heat transfer or you're going to use the conjugate heat transfer method. Basically, what's going to happen is similar to like the finite volume method. It's going to discretize the STL file, and it's going to use that as a boundary method. And what this will do is this will calculate heat conduction in the wall and the heat transfer between like surrounding bodies and the wall. And to do that, if we go into our Properties tab, you can see the thermal boundary. By default, like I said, it's going to be set to adiabatic, so you can change that either to isothermal or calc. And then also too, just I always like to point it out is when we actually set up our boundaries, or when we set up our wall definitions and things like that, if you notice in the details section, there's an initial temperature where we can actually define like how hot our walls are going to be and things like that. So that's always good to know that that's there. And then the other thing too is we need to specify our specific heat capacity and thermal capacity for our fluid properties. Basically, this is going to be in our, if we go into our fluids, we'll have things like thermal conductivity, specific heat, those things we can manipulate and adjust. And if we wanted to say like the viscosity, the specific heat, and the thermal conductivity are temperature dependent, we can change that from a non-Newtonian fluid to none to, there's a couple of different options. I always forget them off the top of my head, but we can change those and really kind of play around with temperature dependent properties. Of course, when we're looking at this stuff, we have to activate the thermal solver. That's going to be in our MPS tab. And this is just a little example I made. This is the piston cooling example that's in some of the more recent versions of Particleworks. What I did was ran this a little bit longer You can kind of see here that we have like a little bit of a temperature distribution in the oil gallery. Of course, I just made a top view just because it's a little bit easier to see without the piston moving up and down. But this is a really good example if you wanted to start kind of getting your hands on in the heat transfer game. This one tackles the conjugate heat transfer specifically. So if you have some interest in that, I would recommend following it. It's a really good example. Now, one thing I will say, there is a bit of a typo in the tutorial. It's a really easy fix though. When Particleworks version 7.2 came out, we have a couple of options. We can either set our conjugate heat transfer to be either unsteady or steady. To actually follow the steps that's required for the tutorial, you need to select the unsteady type, and then from there you can select the HTC and the conjugate heat transfer and then the implicit method. Those are going to be shown in step 3. Not sure why this wasn't updated, but I know this question has came up to me maybe about a month ago or something like that, and it took me a little bit to figure out what was going on. But yeah, that's the way to do that is change the type for simulation to unsteady, and then you can continue following the tutorial that way. And then of course I'm gonna just circle back to this. Always be sure to set your calculations to double precision for the conjugate heat transfer solver. It's just like the finite volume. You need that double precision for stability and a good convergence on your solution. And this is kind of like a freebie tip for everybody, just because I've run into this a couple of times and I felt really dumb after running through a simulation that maybe took me a couple of hours and realized at the very end I forgot to set my initial temperatures. So I briefly mentioned it at the very beginning of my presentation, but when you select either the fluid object or whatever wall objects you're looking at, there is a spot for an initial temperature to define these. So if you're looking to do a heat transfer, and let's say you run a simulation and you look at maybe the heat transfer coefficient values in the drop-down menu, and you say, well, there's nothing really there. I keep coming up with 0. Go back. Might be good to go back and double check to make sure you did set the initial temperatures. It's an easy step to overlook, and like I said, I've run into this pitfall before, so I want to make everybody aware. This is a freebie. Be sure to do this, and your heat transfer coefficients will make sense and they won't be 0. So just some stuff that I've learned. Yeah, but with that, that's everything I kind of wanted to go through today. Again, I know it's not a lot in depth just because of the time constraint, but if there's any questions on any of the heat transfer capabilities, feel free to contact either myself or email our support stuff, and we'll be glad to help you out with any heat transfer questions that you might have. That, I'm going to stop sharing, and I will pass the torch back over to James.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a really good overview. And I think as folks are, in 6 months don't remember everything about heat transfer, having that, short video in the knowledge base is going to be really helpful. All right, so my presentation today is also not going to be super technical. I wanted to go over a handful of the little user interface tips and tricks. A lot of these are things that have been added over maybe the past few years. So a lot of our longtime customers maybe don't realize that some of these little things got added over the years. The first one, actually, this has been true since I started working with Particleworks, but the default setting for the camera view option is in perspective, and I'm not sure that everyone realizes that this can be changed. So I'd say 99 times out of 100, I want to be looking at things in an orthographic view. So right angles are actually right angles, and that's just if you click on camera, there's this ortho option. So anytime I make a new scene, this is probably the first thing that I always do is go into camera settings and turn this to ortho. It used to be that I would also change the rotation mode, but now this is defaulted to trackball. All right, next thing, so this I think we had covered several months ago, but again, not sure that everyone's aware. So there's this new snapshot tool that was added, I believe in 7.1, might have been 7.0. And what this does is it takes a snapshot, as the name implies, of basically all of the settings and options that you have in the model from a graphical standpoint. So if you have a camera position in one spot and maybe half of your objects are visible, half of them are hidden, that sort of stuff is all captured inside of the snapshot. So this can be really useful if you have 4 different spots in the model that you need to grab post-processing data from or grab screenshots from. It gives you a lot of consistency. And if you're like me, you have a tendency to leave the default names of snapshot, snapshot _1, 2, 3, etc. And then in your head you're thinking, well, I'll remember which one each of these is, and 2 weeks later you've completely forgotten, right? So they do have an additional window. So this will never show up by default, but if you go into Window, there's this snapshot, and it'll bring up a side pane showing you basically a preview of what that snapshot looks like. So it can be really helpful for going back and figuring out what's what and jumping to the correct snapshot. And just like in the outline, you can right-click and do Apply Snapshot. Same thing applies here. You can right-click on any of these and jump directly to that snapshot. Right, and then plotting. So again, this is something that they've improved over the past couple of years. Used to be that basically all of your plotting had to be done in Excel, but now you can do kind of sanity check type analyses directly in Particleworks instead of always needing to jump over to Excel and then read in whatever CSV file is of interest. So there's 2 different ways that you can do this. I'll cover the first one here. There's this plot overlay object, and this one shows up on top of your 3D window. So it gives you kind of a live update. And you can add multiple of these. You can reposition them. I won't go into all of the options, but I just want to make sure that you're aware you can basically add some plotting object directly on the user interface. And then the other one is more if you're trying to do slightly more in-depth. So I would say the plot overlay is good for more general post-processing. Like let's say you want to have a live update of how many particles are in your scene. That sort of thing is a good use case. For example, if you're looking at maybe convergence on torque values, you might want to use the animation plots. So these show up in basically 2 different ways. You can go to the top of the window and do animation, show animation plots, and then you'll be able to select what object you want to be plotting. And there's a bunch of drop downs to do filtering. The other option is for a lot of the result objects, you can right click on them and get some relevant outputs of interest. So if you click on a polygon, it'll show you load torques, and then it'll pop up, do you want like X, Y, Z, etc. Then once you do the actual plotting, it shows up in a separate window like this. And then you can zoom in on things. You can, do kind of quick sanity check type things. You won't be able to do advanced plotting type stuff that you would in Excel. That's not really the purpose of it, but just, quick checks type stuff. Oh, and then the last thing, I won't cover it in detail, but if you right click on this, the actual plotting window, it'll give you an option to show table, and then you can export just the data that's on the table. So that can be sometimes useful if opening up the CSV file, there might be several dozen columns that you have to filter out. If you want to just filter to a handful of things and then get a CSV file with only that data, you can do that using the animation plots. Another thing that I use this all the time if I'm comparing 2 different versions of the same scene is the multi-view option. So you can find it, it's this little button right here. Kind of done a zoom in right here. It'll give you a pop-up basically asking you how many rows and columns you want and which scene should be shown in each window. So this is a quadrant view, and in this case it's showing me the same scene. So you can either show the same scene from multiple different angles, or you can show 2 different scenes. And there's a couple of different options for syncing up, like the frame count that you're on, the color mapping properties, and the camera position. So I use this all the time if I'm maybe trying out one setting difference, and I want to put them side by side and play the animations back. That can be super useful. And then another thing that I'm not sure everyone knows, they added the clipping object has always been there, or at least as long as I've worked with the software. And this is, that rectangular prism or that cube that shows up by default. And if you turn it on, it basically only shows objects that are inside of that box. There's a couple of limitations with it, right? You can only show one object, or there's only one clipping object allowed in any scene. And it can also get confusing if if you're cutting through the middle of geometry, it can be a little confusing to look at sometimes because it won't show you that cross section. And that's one of the reasons that they added this profile tool. So this is in the miscellaneous folder. The same way you would add like the insolver, post-processing, all that sort of stuff. You'll see it listed as profile, and you can add as many of these as you want to a scene. And instead of being a box, it's a clipping plane. And you can position that plane or rotate it however you want. And then the really nice thing is it has this capping option. So this is how you can get the shaded interior volume of parts. There's a few different things that have to be turned on for that to work. Capping has to be enabled on the profile. The profile has to be enabled. That one's kind of obvious. The hide has to be turned off. If you hide a profile while it's enabled, then you just won't see the clipping volume or that cross section view. And then this is the one that always trips everyone up. The render as solid option has to be turned on for the particular geometry that you're looking at. So this is in the appearance details of the geometry, and this is turned off by default. So if you turn the profile on and you're like, this isn't that helpful, you can multi-select all of your geometry and make sure that render as solid is turned on. All right, and then the last two things that I wanted to show are going to make way more sense interactively versus on slides. Let me jump over. First thing I wanted to talk about is let me do the color bar first. So if we go in here, this is something, I don't change it that often, but every once in a while it is super useful to be able to modify how the color bar shows up. And I don't think everyone realizes that you can even customize this. So if you click on the color bar in the widget folder of the outline, you can scroll down here and go to widget details. And there's a bunch of options for customizing the way it's displayed. One common thing that I see people do is they'll change how these labels are applied. So this label format, by default, it's in scientific notation. You can change that to just like a floating number. So this is no scientific notation by changing the E to an F. You can also change the number of decimal points that it'll show. The dot whatever is how many significant digits will be shown. And then there's also this option for ticks. So let me change this to 5. And you can see with that, we get sub steps shown along the color bar. And there's a bunch of different things you can change to customize how it displays, but I think that gets the idea across. And last thing I'll mention on this label format, if you're trying to figure out how to accomplish some particular thing, the search term you'll need is printf. That's the computer science name for how these work. So if you search on Google or whatever your search provider is, printf syntax, that'll give you all of the special codes that this uses to figure out how to display whatever the label should be. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll show is this copy-paste functionality. So this is also relatively recent, but on most objects, you can right-click on them and you'll probably see copy-paste. So copy, and then I can right-click on this and do paste, and it applies that. So this is kind of the use case that I use it for most often, if I'm trying to take changes from one scene and apply them to another, I'll use copy and paste or the scene comparison. Those are both very good ways to do it. And then also, let's say you have, maybe you set your initial temperature on one piece of geometry. You can right-click on it and do copy and paste it to everything else. Yeah, if I have to apply the same change in a bunch of places, that's a useful tip to know. And with that, I think that concludes all of the little UI things that I wanted to cover. Now, let me see if there are any questions in the chat. I'm not seeing any at this point. We'll hang around for a minute or two if you want to put a question in last minute. Otherwise, as Chris mentioned, you can always reach out to us or open a ticket.